So I'd like to begin, as we have the last few weeks, with some just public service announcements and public recognition announcements. Firstly, the Mazel Tov this week to Eyal Levine and Ari and Ariella and Michal, the entire Levine family, and extended indeed a round of applause and a thumbs up on this wonderful occasion of Eyal's bar mitzvah, who learned beautifully yesterday morning, and we are all already proud of for all that he has accomplished as a Jewish man, and we look forward and anticipate to all that he will accomplish in the years ahead. So Mazel Tov to you and the whole family, and we look forward to celebrating with you in person, please God, soon. I've noticed that I say soon a lot, and that can be read in a number of ways by different people. You should read that as it stands, as aspirational. I don't have a set date. We don't have a set date. But we do hope it is soon. It's not going to be tomorrow. It's not going to be before May 15th. It's unlikely to be any time before Shavuot. But the idea is that soon, in our aspiration, we will be with each other. I'm relieved to say that there are no condolences to be announced this week. But having said that, there are people who are still in the wake of losses from weeks back who deserve our attention and our outreach and our care. And I will say this week we have a number of sponsors for our time and our Torah this afternoon, this Erev Shabbos. We have an anonymous sponsor who's sponsoring in honor of the youth department for keeping the fun and love of YIJE going. And yes, thank you, Michael, for your anonymous donation. It is absolutely astounding what Zach has pulled together with his team, and of course, the lay leadership and his father and Lag BaOmer. Sounds like it is going to be fabulous, absolutely fabulous, which, by the way, is a sitcom in the UK, absolutely fabulous, but I think it's from the 70s or something, but apparently it's funny. I also want to recognize the sponsorship from Simcha Minsky, who's sponsoring in memory of his father, Owen Minsky, from Phyllis Fassler, who's sponsoring in memory of her parents, Harold Karpel and Sylvia Karpel, and Hal Galita, who's sponsoring in memory of his father, Simcha Ben Yisrael HaKohen. Their neshamot should all have aliyot, as our learning this afternoon should be in their merit, and their memory should be for us as a blessing. So I will have to give a completely different drasha, because I heard in the moments before I started that Rabbi Marcus gave a wonderful drasha yesterday. So let's see how this goes. See if you can pick up on any references to the Netflix's The Crown as we go along. The high priest exemplifies spiritual celebrity. By law, he was required to possess wealth and health and wisdom and distinction. His majesty was to be upheld. His veneration was thoroughly compelled, and access to him was withheld. At every moment of every day, though he occupied a pride of place in the minds and lives of the public, he was insulated from the influence of the masses. Though his clerical weight drew our collective gaze, he was by divine dictate kept at bay. Maimonides, in his Code of Law, the Mishnah Torah, catalogues the constraints around the Kohen Gadol intended to maintain his grandeur and his status. Lo yikanes levet hamishter v'lo leseuda shel rabim. Maimonides says the Kohen Gadol could not attend public parties or feasts, afilu hem shel mitzvah, even if they serve a religious purpose, even if they celebrate a rite of passage, he's forbidden to attend. Chayiv Kohen Gadol in ho kavod ba'atzmo, and a high priest has to treat himself with dignity, v'lo yikel ba'atzmo, and is forbidden to treat himself lightly. V'lo yiru oto arum, the people are not allowed to see the Kohen Gadol undressed. Lo b'beit hamercha, it's neither in the bathhouse or the bathroom or the barber. And the root of all this regimentation lies in the opening lines of our parsha, when the title of this week's parsha begins, Emor el Kohanim b'nei Aaron. Moses is told by God to tell the sons of Aaron, the Kohanim, va'amarta aleihem, and say to them, lenefesh lo yitama ba'amav, none shall defile themselves for the disease among the people. Priests, as heirs and aides to Aaron lived their lives within the parameters of an intricate and elaborate and sinuous maze of edicts and ordinances intended to screen them from ritual contamination. They are an elite tribal subset reared on hallowed etiquette that raises them above the people as models of angelic virtue. Kohanim are an ensemble of leaders and teachers and preachers whose lives unfold above the fray of political strife, who reside in a realm beyond raw powers exercised, who imbue pilgrims with awe and exude a sense that there is more to life than petty attachment and self-interest. Kohanim promote an ideal vision of human devotion to perpetuity and thus must keep their distance from that which deteriorates, decays, and fades. Led by the best of them, Kohanim are to remain at a remove from real people to preserve their angelic and exemplary stature. And it was a man who abdicated the throne of the United Kingdom in favor of coming to the United States, who was known to his friends and his family by the last of his four given names, David, who, witnessing the coronation of his niece, the current queen, at least according to the crown, said when his house guests wondered why the screen went blank as she was anointed, he said, "Who wants transparency when you can have magic? Who wants prose when you can have poetry? Pull away the veil and what are you left with? An ordinary young woman of modest ability and little imagination, but wrap her up like this, anoint her with oil, and what do you have? A goddess." And lahavdil, this distance-driven poetic enchantment is precisely embodied by the Kohanim's remoteness from the people. But here is my question. You may be wondering when the question was coming. This is my question. Why in this instruction does God repeat himself? Emor Kohanim b'nei Aaron, say to the Kohanim, the sons of Aaron, v'amarta alehem, and say to them. What is gained with this double saying? What is contained in this echo? What is meant by this unwarranted expenditure of consecrated text? Why does God tell Moshe to tell the Kohanim something and then, without telling him what it is, tell him to tell them again? What is with all this telling? And there are two answers that I would like to share with you this Erev Shabbat, this afternoon, beginning with the writings of the son of the Khatam Sofer, the Ketav Sofer. And for him, the rationale for the excess in our verse is straightforward. The message of repetition is emphasis. In his words, Srichin Ziras Gadol, these Kohanim needed deep determination, la'atzur atzman, to restrain themselves, shelo ya'avru, that they should not transgress. For the Ketav Sofer, Moshe is told to tell his brother and his kin of these limits and prescriptions on their lives with a particular stress and emphasis in order to keep the priests in check. For without the proper accent on their import, these restrictions for the Ketav Sofer would have been breached. And the question, of course, is why? Why would the Kohanim breach these laws, having already been taught the tiers of assorted ritual routines? Why would these specific limits be flouted? Now, some have suggested that the externally appealing amenities of celebrity in fact veil a veritable medley of pressures and stresses of a life lived in the public eye. As Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, confesses aboard the Britannia, we're now on the second season of The Crown, he says, despite the palaces and the opulence of royal life, the attention paid to the conventions and protocols of sovereignty render his titles and his position as little more than a gilded prison, triggering in him a thirst for the freedom of being unexceptional. And the very same pressures to maintain purity and piety as a nation's eyes detect every lapse apply to the priest's manacles of majesty. Hence, divine pressure is laid on Moshe to lay emphasis on these rules so the Kohanim should not seek to breach them in search of freedom. That's one view. for why there is a need for emphasis here. But the Ksav Sofer himself has a very different suggestion. He says it is not merely the pressures of the public eye and a venal desire for freedom from the proprieties of nobility that elicits this emphasis. There is another reason that the priests may have breached these laws in particular. There is another reason that God seeks to stress their inviolate nature, and it is in the Kohanim's blood. As descendants of Aaron, the figure most associated with compassion and pastoral care, the Kohanim, in his words, are mishtokakin tamid la'asot chesed, perpetually craving to perform kindness. So told now to keep at bay from those who have passed away goes against.
I just missed the call. To be
told to leave the truest of kindnesses to others and maintain a distance bristles at the very core of their conscience. This is why Moshe is told to tell them twice, to emphasize the importance of their purity and their embodied pedagogy, and for the final time now, to draw on the crown once more. Queen Mary, the grandmother of the current queen, remarked, monarchy is God's sacred mission to grace and dignify the earth, to give ordinary people an ideal to strive towards, an example of nobility and duty to raise them up. And this, lahavdil, again, is the calling of the Kohanim, to live lives of embodied purity and duty and nobility and dignity, and to maintain all those traits. They must restrain themselves from acting upon their innate sympathies, from getting down in the trenches with the people. Once more, for the Ksav Sofer, it is not because the Kohanim perceive regulations and restrictions as infractions and infringements on their freedom, but because they see them as obstacles to their ethos, to serve people in need. That leads God to stress their severity. But there is, very briefly, one more way to see this apparent redundancy is our verse as having nothing to do with an emphatic strategy, whether it is to rail against narcissism or sensitive tendencies. This view of Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Spector sees this redundancy as not redundant, but as dividing the verse in half. And Rabbi Spector, who is the namesake of YU's Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary, or REAP, he says, Emor leKohanim b'nei Aaron v'amarta aleihem does not mean say to the Kohanim, the children of Aaron, and say to them. Moshe is not asked to impart a single message to his brother and his nephews. Moshe is told to say two distinct things, and each Emor precedes a separate message. And this is how the verse should be read. Emor leKohanim, say to the priests, b'nei Aaron, you are the children of Aaron. V'amarta aleihem, and then say to them, lenefesh lo yitamar ba'amar, none shall defile themselves among the people. For of Spector, the emphasis here is not on the need to adhere to the strictures of law, assuming an innate and unbreakable empathy on the part of the Kohanim. The emphasis here is dual, and it is designed for human beings who are torn between compassion to the other and the self. The priests, who could quite easily adapt to a life of luxury and seclusion, are told in one and the same sentence to keep those laws of seclusion, but never to forget the care that defined their predecessors. They are told not to defile themselves and to maintain their distance, but are also reminded of a fact, the significance of which could be too easily forgotten. They are b'nei Aaron. In their seclusion, they are to maintain their empathy. In their purity, they are not to disdain the laity. In their isolation, they are not to forget the people whom they serve and work to preserve their compassion. And on a call yesterday, arranged by the OU and others, Dr. Fauci, who I'm sure we are all now familiar with, said that the kind of social interaction that is the core of the beauty of Jewish culture has unfortunately led to a situation of higher risk. We are all reared from infancy to interact and intermingle, to see ourselves as part of a larger whole. And this interconnectedness has bred over the course of centuries a culture soaked in sympathy and care, because we are all heirs to Aaron's love of peace and harmony and people. And it is this incubated drive to be part of each other's lives that makes this time so hard for so many of us who are so used to and dependent on and desperate for each other's company. And to this, the Tav Sofer's emphasis rings in our ears to remind us to keep our distance and restrain our nature, to stay away as a manifestation of love for each other, to see our ostensible distance as an expression of abiding care. And soon, as I said, please God, soon, we will begin to ease back into some form of tzibur, of public prayer. But for now, we hold the line. Lenefesh lo yitamar ba'amav. For the sake of life, we are not to contaminate other people. But at the same time, as many of us adapt to life in these times, our social sympathies may weaken as our sense of self expands. We may enter into what Dr. Vivek Murthy, a former US Surgeon General, has called a social recession. Just this morning, the Secretary General of the UN announced that this pandemic has unleashed a tsunami of hate and xenophobia, of scapegoating and scaremongering. He said that anti-foreigner sentiment has surged both online and in the streets, that anti-Semitic conspiracy theories have spread, and that COVID-19 related anti-Muslim attacks have occurred. He said that migrants and refugees have been vilified, that the elderly and the vulnerable have been satirized, and he has called upon the heads of nations across the globe to spread kindness and compassion. And we, as Jews, are not only heirs to our ancestors' empathies, but we are summoned by God to be a mamlechet kohanim, a kingdom of priests. So this Shabbat, this coming week, let us all deepen our priestliness. Let us all see ourselves as Bnei Aaron, as heirs to Aaron's care and compassion and love. Let us hold in our hearts that delicate balance between wanting to go back to normal and knowing that we can't right now, but refusing to let that knowledge erode our values and commitment to each other, to world Jewry, and to humankind. I want to wish you all a Shabbat Shalom, a Shabbat of peace, a Shabbat of rest, a Shabbat of health, a Shabbat of joy. I'm going to